Anyway, this morning I want to talk about the Simons because we've talked about various groups of people in the New Testament where we've got lots of people that have the same name. The Jameses, the Judases, the Marys. So the last one of these today, next slide, is the Simons. He's the father of Judas Iscariot, and we don't know for certain that he was actually known as Simon Iscariot, but we know that Judas Iscariot's father was named Simon. Simon the leper is the guy at Bethany on the Mount of Olives that Jesus had lunch during the Passion Week. Maybe on Thursday of that week, and Mary, who is the sister of Martha, came and anointed him while he was at the house of Simon the leper, eating apparently lunch, having the noon meal. And Simon of Cyrene, of course, is the guy that gets pressed into service to carry the cross when Jesus is going to the cross. So a couple of things about the Simons. I'll talk more about Simon the Zealot in a moment. But first of all, Simon's super common name in the first century. Many, many men known by this name. And so Simon Peter is an example of a guy named Simon who picks up a second name, which becomes a particular identifier for him. Peter is a nickname that is given to him. And you notice that, I pointed out when we talked about Peter himself, that Jesus addresses him as Simon mostly when he's rebuking him, when he's done something foolish, and addresses him as Peter when he is doing something that is useful. And so Petra is the nickname that Jesus gives him and calls him when he seems to be doing the things that reflect the new life, and he seems to call him Simon when he thinks he's doing stuff that reflects the old life instead. Simon the Zealot, Simon the Tanner, Simon the Leper. A lot of these guys are named or known to us based on some characteristic about them. Their line of work, something physically about them. Simon Magus, what did he do? Simon, the brother of Jesus, by his relationship. Simon of Cyrene, by where did he come from? Clearly, when he was back home, Simon of Cyrene was not known as Simon of Cyrene because everyone was of Cyrene back there, right? So when he's in Jerusalem, he's known as Simon of Cyrene, and he's known to us in that way. Simon, the brother of Jesus, is one of the four brothers of Jesus. We talked about that. James and Jude are the two brothers of Jesus who wrote epistles in the New Testament. James the Just, as he is known to us, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem from very early. You see in the book of Acts that the 12 are to some extent deferring to James the Just, to James the brother of Jesus, when Paul comes and says, we've got to sort this thing out about whether you've got to be a Jew before you can be a Christian. It is James who seems to be leading the meeting, and James who seems to render the judgment, and James that everyone agrees with and follows along with. Even though he's not one of the 12, he becomes a huge figure in the Jerusalem church very early on. Simon is another brother, and not much is known about him, but it is believed that he was functionally the second bishop of Jerusalem. It's not clear that the term bishop was actually applied to James the Just, during his time as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. It's not clear that he was known as the bishop during his lifetime. And it's possible that Simon, as his successor, was not known by that title either. It's possible. And we'll talk about titles and leadership roles a little later on. But it is believed by many that when James was killed, when he was martyred, when he was thrown down from the parapet of the temple and beaten to death with a fuller's club, that Simon, the brother of Jesus, succeeded him as the head of the church in Jerusalem. And it is believed by several people that Simon remained the head of the church in Jerusalem until about AD 107. So pretty late, for a long time. That's going on 40 years after James is thrown from the parapet of the temple. And Hippolytus claims that Simon lived to age 120, which could be true. It's a little bit of a long shot, but it could be true. And that's how you've got him serving that late. It's also possible that Simon was much younger than James, that he is 15 or 20 years younger than Jesus. And so that in 107, he is not even 90 years old. So that is also possible. Eusebius calls the bishop Simeon of Jerusalem and says that he was the son of Clopas, who was regarded as the brother of Joseph and thereby a cousin of Jesus. But Eusebius early on gets into this idea that maybe Mary didn't have any other children, and we have to come up with other explanations. So in the 320s, when Eusebius is writing, he is already looking for explanations about how the four brothers of Jesus are not actually the brothers of Jesus. So it's possible that he is indeed talking about the guy who is the brother of Jesus, but just making him a cousin. Eusebius says that subsequent to James being thrown from the parapet of the temple and martyred, that there was a meeting that was convened of surviving apostles and surviving other key leaders from the very early church, from the foundations of the church, and that they picked Simon as the new leader of the church at Jerusalem. So this would happen either at Pella. Simon is believed to have led the church, the key Christians, out of Jerusalem before the Roman siege and taken them to Pella, and that the Christian community from Jerusalem was preserved during the Roman siege by Simon taking the church to Pella. Whether this happened after James was martyred or whether that was something that James signed off on to get most of the church out of Jerusalem while he stayed is unclear. But almost anybody who was associated with the church who stayed in Jerusalem during the Roman siege was killed. Some of them by the Zealots and the Jewish radicals who saw Christians as traitors and as potential collaborators with the Romans. And so Christians during the siege were subject to be killed by their neighbors and by other people that they came into contact with, by people in the street, for the basic idea that they were not Jews or they were not serious Jews, and that therefore they were a threat to national security, if you will. And so the Romans then killed most of the people in the city because Jerusalem had a bad reputation as a place that fomented insurrection and trouble. And so the Romans, desiring to not face this again, killed most of the survivors and sold the rest off into slavery and emptied the city out when they conquered it in 70 AD. So there were survivors, but the survivors were sold off as slaves and scattered in many places. So the church in Jerusalem was preserved because Simon had taken a group of believers to Pella, from which they later returned to Jerusalem. And it's believed that Simon was eventually executed by a Roman governor, maybe around 107, maybe before or after that, and that the motive for that seems to have been that the Romans around the end of the first century, became aware that there was this thing where these people believed that this guy had been raised from the dead, and that this was changing people's lives, and it seemed like there might be some threat to Roman authority here, and that the Romans, thinking that the key to this organization, this movement, was physical relationship to this guy, began to work to try to kill off anybody who was a physical relative of his, a member of his family. Okay, so later on, there's an emperor that actually actively goes to track down anyone who is related by blood to Jesus, and eventually finds the grandsons of Jude, who wrote the letter right before Revelation in your Bible, and finds that they are farmers, and is disappointed to find that they are not educated men, and that there doesn't seem to be anything about them that causes them to be considered as a threat to the state. But Simon, if he's the bishop of Jerusalem, is a leader and has some education and could easily be seen as a threat by the Romans. And so there is a good likelihood that that's the story of the martyrdom of Simon, the brother of Jesus. Simon Magus, of course, is a convert from Samaria. The Samaritan guy who eventually tries to buy the Holy Spirit from Peter and is rebuked. And then there are many traditions about how he basically backslid in the faith and became a leader of an alternate movement, and Peter confronted him in Rome, which may or may not be true. Anyway, but these are some of the Simons. Simon of Cyrene, of course, is known to us as the father of Rufus and Alexander. Rufus is one of the people that Paul writes to in the letter to the Romans. So Rufus was in Rome later on. But Rufus and Alexander were associated with the church in some way, such that Mark, among others, in writing his gospel, thought it was necessary to mention that Simon of Cyrene is the father of Rufus and Alexander, because he knew that he was writing to people who would know those guys, or would have met those guys, or would have had some connection with those guys. And so that's somebody that there was at least a second generation of believers in his family. So next slide, let's talk for a moment about Simon the Zealot, one of the 12. So Luke is the guy that calls him Simon Zelotes, Simon the Zealot. In Matthew and Mark, he's known as Simon the Cananean. At least that's the way it's typically translated. There's a linguistic thing going on here with respect to these labels. Simon Zelotes is the way I think the King James has him. And in the New Testament, he appears only in the apostolic list. But the linguistic thing is it's unclear what the term that we end up translating the zealot or the Cananean, and those are different words, but they're related words, what that is actually supposed to mean. So I've long associated Simon the Zealot with the Zealots, the revolutionaries, the radicals, the people that were associated with violent opposition to Rome, who spawned the Sicarii, the knife men who knifed people in the streets. And as that, I think of him as a guy who would have seen Matthew, the tax collector, as a traitor worthy of death. The challenge that goes with that is, although the Zealot movement goes all the way back to AD 6 at least, there's a guy named Judas of Gamala who led opposition to the census of Quirinius, the census that's at the beginning of Luke. And Judas of Gamala pushed people to not participate in the census and to do what they could to undermine the census in opposition to Roman rule. But the Zealot movement as an organized group really doesn't seem to exist until about 50 or 55 AD. So after the time of the Gospels by maybe 20 years. And so if Simon the Zealot was a zealot, he wasn't part of a really organized party. He was just a zealous guy, a guy who was fired up about Judaism, about the faith, about his relationship with God, but probably not a violent opponent of Roman rule. David? So, what have we seen as we think about the representations in art of the apostles? And I don't want to take you back to the whole Bartholomew thing and give you nightmares, sorry. But they are almost always pictured with something that represents something about the way that they were martyred. So what happened to Isaiah, by the way? The prophet Isaiah? He was sawn in half. He was sawn in half while he was alive, okay, at least at the beginning, right? Okay, the prophet Isaiah, it is long believed that he was sawn in half, that he was eventually martyred, that the king or whoever got really irritated with the stuff that he was preaching and the stuff that he was writing in his prophecies, and so he was sawn in half. And this is a reference, we believe this is a reference in the book of Hebrews, the Faith Hall of Fame, that's sawn in half is a specific reference to the prophet Isaiah. It's a general reference maybe to other people, but that it is specifically a reference to Isaiah in particular. The one of the 12 who is associated with being sawn in half is Simon the Zealot. The evidence for that is not particularly strong. In the Middle Ages, when people became fascinated with the martyrdom of the apostles, people started saying not only was Simon the Zealot sawn in half, but he wasn't sawn laterally like Isaiah, he was sawn longitudinally. Okay, that's getting into just, anyway. Well, yeah, that's that's a little hard to believe on several levels. So, plus, that's a lot of work. I mean, you have to be really, really motivated about the person you're trying to kill to go to that level of effort. So, but it is one of the fundamentals of art, painting and sculpture in particular, in the Western tradition, that shows the 12 apostles is to give them identifiers that are tied to things that are believed to be true about their martyrdoms. Yeah, so art tells, through the Middle Ages when there is very low literacy, the emblems, the pictorial things are fundamental to telling the story and to helping people to see things. And also, of course, artists were facing the reality that although there were some traditions about how these guys looked, there was very little specific information about how these guys looked. And so you get a lot of gray-haired guys with long beards kinds of stuff, because it seems like as good a guess as any is what a man who is in his 60s or 70s, as some of these guys were when they were martyred, might have looked like. But you want to make them individuals. And in art, they were not just trying to make them an individual, but they were trying to make each individual represent something. They would speak to people that would preach, as you would say today. Something that was a story, that would teach something, would tell people something. So Simon the Zealot the likelihood that he was a member of the Zealots is really low because the Zealots weren't organized at the time that Jesus was preaching. There's no evidence that the Zealots were an organized party. Josephus, in his history, is very interested in the Jewish groups. And Josephus says that in the late 50s, a fourth group, beyond the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, became part of the scene in Judea. And that fourth group became known as the Zealots. But that it was into maybe even the 60s before the Zealots were an organized kind of a group. Philo seems to agree with that. He's the other Jewish historian who writes at the time and is writing about Jewish politics, and so would be very interested in these kinds of Jewish groups and organizations. Josephus, of course, writes with some pretty serious axes to grind. Okay, so you always have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about what does Josephus say. And Josephus is very strong on self-justification as well. So, but there's nothing about the Zealots that Josephus is connected to. He doesn't seem to have any relationship to that. And so there's not any particular reason to believe that he's not telling the straight-up story when he's talking about the Zealots. So a lot of people put Barabbas, the robber, if you read the New Testament fairly closely, he's a robber and an insurrectionist of some sort. He's a murderer. He's a guy who's been killing Romans. But he is not actually in the New Testament tied to the Zealots as a group. If the Zealots were an organized group at the time, maybe he fits. He really seems to fit more the model of a highwayman, of a guy who is robbing people out on the roads and targeting people that he doesn't like. That is, he's mostly targeting Romans or Hellenized Jews who seem wealthy. So he's playing Robin Hood a little bit. I'm robbing just from people that hardly anybody likes anyway. But that may be because if he does that, then he can hide out in local villages because they'll think he's not going to rob from us. He just robs from people that we don't like, people that oppress us, people that we dislike and disapprove of. So we have imposed a bit of a backstory where there are Zealots in the 30s or maybe even the 20s, but there's not actually any strong evidence that that was true. So it's possible that Simon the Zealot is a man who was zealous for the faith and not zealous to overturn the political order, that he was really not a revolutionary, and that maybe he and Matthew wouldn't have butted heads quite so much. If he was very zealous for the faith, he would still have had big issues with Matthew, by the way, because he would have seen Matthew as a man who was fundamentally unserious about the faith, working for the Romans, being a tax collector, all of that. They would have seen that as disqualifying as a Jew. So they would still have had some significant issues. But Matthew and Mark call him Simon the Canaanian. And people have long assumed, I long assumed, that Canaanian means he was from Canaan and maybe he was a loyalist to Canaan as a philosophical or political entity. Canaan, of course, being an old name that is associated with the coastal communities that were part of Judea at the time in the first century. The problem with that is the term Canaanian is not used anywhere else in the New Testament, and there is no extra biblical text that exists from the first century that uses the term Canaanian to identify anyone or anyone. And so there's nothing to really give us any sense that that's a label that meant anything to anybody in the first century, and that was a label that was important. Jerome, translating the Bible into Latin, believed that Canaanian meant that Simon was from Cana in Galilee. which is likely a wrong assumption. And Jerome eventually started the idea that Simon, the guy from Cana, was the groom at the wedding where Jesus turned the water to wine. Okay, that's a super stretch that's not based on anything, so that's likely a wrong assumption. But this term, Simon the Zealot, is a difficult one to get at. Simon the Zealot, Simon the Canaanian. And the term that we get zealot from in English and the term that we get Canaanian from in English, those terms are very close to each other. Linguistically, in the original, those are labels that come very close together. And so there are reasons to think that they may be two variations on the same word, the same idea. But there's a possibility that Simon the Zealot is just a man who is zealous for the faith, and that the other things that we put on him, kind of the political things, don't really fit. So it is absolutely true that Simon is one of the least known and least attested of the 12. Jerome, in 392, 393, wrote a collection of 135 short biographies of key figures in the life of the church to that time. Simon the Zealot didn't make the list.
I don't think he sounds very zealous then.
He's the only one of the 12 that didn't make the cut for Jerome's 135 key figures of the faith, written in 392, 393. So Jerome doesn't say why not. And it may just have been that Jerome didn't have enough information to be able to say anything about Simon the Zealot, but he didn't include him for whatever reason. So despite the fact that he is long identified with the saw, and there's a tradition that goes back for a ways, at least to the 4th century, that he was sawn in half, but not much earlier than that. And none of the traditions with respect to Simon the Zealot are very strong. But most of the traditions about Simon the Zealot have him crucified, not sawn in half. So there is plenty of reasons to question whether the saw is actually a true indicator of what happened to Simon, but it is a thing that has been associated with him for going back 1,500 years or so anyway. There is a thing called the Syriac infancy gospel, or some people call it the Arabic infancy gospel, since the earliest copies are in Arabic, which appears to date to sometime in the 5th century. This document has alleged encounters of the young Jesus with key figures from the New Testament while he was a child. It has Jesus as a child meeting Judas Iscariot. It has Jesus as a child meeting the thieves who would be on the cross. And it has Jesus as a child healing Simon the Zealot of a snake bite, and telling Simon that one day you will be my disciple. That's one of the only things about Simon the Zealot that's in apocryphal, in heretical literature that comes out of the 4 or 5 centuries after the New Testament. There is almost no interest by Gnostics and other heretical groups in Simon the Zealot. They didn't write stuff about him. They didn't create stuff about him. There's not any real extra biblical stuff other than that one thing. So no consistent traditions, no real hard information about Simon the Zealot, and no traditions that we can date before the 4th century. So one of the things that's true about Simon the Zealot as a result is because there was such limited stuff, by the Middle Ages, it had become a huge point of pride for cities and countries to be able to point to some association with an apostle. And Simon the Zealot seemed, by the Middle Ages, to be the guy that was sort of the free agent. He wasn't tied to any particular story very deeply, and so lots of places came up with stories to say, well, Simon the Zealot came here. He's our guy. And so there are stories that tie Simon the Zealot to almost everywhere in the ancient world that come out of the Middle Ages. Because everybody was looking for a connection with an apostle, and he seemed like the available guy. So there are stories about he traveled with Jude to Egypt or in Persia, Armenia, Lebanon, that he went to Egypt, that he traveled through what is now Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, that he went to Britain, that he went to Persia, where he was sawn in half at a place called Suanir, which is an otherwise unknown city, that he was crucified in Syria, that he died at Edessa, that he stayed in Jerusalem and died there, maybe during the siege. There are relics that are held at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. There's also a church in Tolosa in Spain that says it has relics of Simon the Zealot. There's a church in Toulouse in France that says it has relics of Simon the Zealot. And there was a cathedral in Cologne, Germany, that for centuries claimed to have key relics of Simon the Zealot, which was destroyed in World War II, and those were apparently lost as a result. McBurney argues that Simon left Jerusalem eventually and went to Cyrene, which is part of Libya today, and then from there went west into the Roman province of Africa, which is part of Tunisia, and then the Roman province of Mauritania, which was the northern part of what is now Algeria, and from there traveled to Britannia, what is now England. Part of McBurney's argument is that in AD 216, there was a meeting of the bishops of the African church at Carthage, and 71 bishops came to that meeting. That the church in Africa in AD 216 was large enough that 71 bishops could come to a meeting. And that's evidence that the church in Africa got an early start. Because if you've got 71 bishops, you've got a big, big church. Because each of those represents a city or a region where there are multiple churches. And that means that by 216, there were 350, 400 or more congregations of Christians in northern Africa. And to get to that, you got an early start. So somebody planted churches very early on in northern Africa. McBurney argues that Simon the Zealot is probably that guy there. And one of the reasons that he argues that Simon the Zealot went to Britain is that somebody took the gospel to Britain very early on. There is a stone that has been recovered in Britain from early in the 2nd century that has the Lord's Prayer engraved on it. By early in the 2nd century, somebody in Britain was engraving the Lord's Prayer on a stone. So that's something that you would have to have some organization, you would have to have multiple Christians, there would have to be some time together before you get to activity like that, almost certainly. So McBurney goes on to say that Simon the Zealot ended up in Britain sometime after about AD 44. That would be a good guess because the Romans invaded Britain in AD 44, and it's likely that no one would have gone there before the Romans had gone there with an army and made it relatively safe to travel. But Queen Boadicea very famously began a revolt against the Romans in AD 60. And so McBurney argues that Simon must have left Britain when the revolt broke out, because that was not a good environment for evangelism and for the expansion of the church while there was this civil war going on, this rebellion against the Roman rules, and that Simon the Zealot went back to Jerusalem to kind of check in and get a new assignment, and that then he was sent to Persia, and that he was martyred in Persia, perhaps on a trip with Jude. So that's a story. McBurney is using a lot of little fragments, and nothing about that story is necessarily wrong, but you can't prove it by any means. Criswell, The Apostles After Jesus, A History of the Apostles, makes the argument that Simon crossed North Africa and founded churches along the way, as described by McBurney, that is correct, that Simon did go to Britain and found churches there, that he was there when the revolt broke out in AD 60, and Criswell argues that Simon almost certainly stayed in Britain, and that basically he crossed the lines to the British side, to the side of Boadicea and her people, and invested himself in building churches amongst the local people, and that he was subsequently captured by the Romans in around AD 74 and crucified as a rebel against the state, because he was associated with those who were rebelling against Roman rule. He was executed as a traitor to Rome, and that this resulted in the destruction of a good bit of his missionary work, the burning of the churches and the dispersal of congregations. And that's a reasonably compelling story. It's also not provable, but it might be the true thing about Simon the Zealot. And the Persia part of the Simon the Zealot story is pretty tough to get at. But the Britain part, I think there's compelling reasons why we should think that Simon the Zealot probably took the gospel to Britain between 45 and 60 AD, and that he may have stayed there until when he was martyred. So that's Simon the Zealot on the left. So if you're keeping score, there's one left, right? And he's the add-on, Matthias. Matthias is the guy that at the beginning of the book of Acts, Peter says we should pick someone to replace Judas Iscariot, and it needs to be someone who has been with us, who's been with Jesus from the beginning. And in a reference, from the time that Jesus was baptized. So through perhaps the whole 3 years of Jesus' public ministry, somebody who is a witness to all of this. So this may mean that Matthias and Judas Barsabbas, who were the two guys who were put forward as candidates for this role, were of the 70 who had gone out 2 by 2. They were people that had been associated with Jesus' ministry very early on. So Matthias is chosen by lot to take the place of Judas Iscariot. This is a unique calling as an apostle. Everybody else who is called as an apostle in the New Testament era is either directly commissioned by Jesus face to face, or is commissioned in some way under the work of the Holy Spirit. Matthias is appointed between the ascension of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit. He's the guy in the gap. And so he's the guy that there's been controversy about his calling as an apostle for that reason all the way down through the ages. Is what is the basis of Matthias being called as an apostle if Jesus wasn't there to put his hands on it, and if the Holy Spirit wasn't actually present in a powerful way to mark this? So So there are controversies with respect to Matthias and arguments about his status all the way down through the ages. Down through the ages, of course, Matthias has been confused with Matthew. In the Greek, those two names are only two letters different. And it really just has to do with the order of the letters. And so Eusebius, for some reason that he's not explained, doesn't call him Matthias at all, calls him Ptolemy, which, of course, Bartholomew is the son of Ptolemy, and that creates all kinds of questions and confusion. But Matthias is actually the least attested of any of the 12, even less than Simon the Zealot. There is some early tradition that maybe he was from Bethlehem. In any case, the two pictures on the right here are Matthias. So the top one is by a guy named Simone Martini from about 1318, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. But it's kind of an iconic style thing from the 1300s, Saint Matthias. And the other is, the lower right, is Matthias by the Dutch painter Peter Paul Rubens from sometime between 1610 and 1612. That one's in the Prado in Madrid. But a couple of very famous paintings in big-time museums. Matthias in the lower right is holding an axe, as he is often depicted holding an axe. So same rules apply with respect to that, right? So Hippolytus, writing very early on, has Matthias remaining in Jerusalem for his whole life and his whole ministry, keeping him there. Others have him going to the land of the man-eaters, the cannibals, and are very nonspecific about where this was, but apparently it was up near the Caspian Sea. There is an ancient Roman fort in ruins in Georgia, not our Georgia, the Georgia near the Caspian Sea, and near the Turkish border there. In that ancient Roman fort, in the ruins, there is a marker from maybe the 2nd century that says that Matthias was buried here. So maybe he was crucified in what is now Georgia. Maybe he was stoned in Jerusalem and then killed with an axe, which is where you get the axe thing. So if you put him in Georgia, then he was almost certainly crucified, and the axe is not right. So if you keep him in Jerusalem, there's a good chance that he was stoned by a mob and then killed with an axe. And the axe is correct, but that the Georgia stuff is wrong, and that the whole bit about the land of the man-eaters is entirely made up. But there's a possibility that Matthias was assigned, when they broke this up, that Matthias was assigned to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and Galilee with James the Greater, James the Less, and James the Just. That the three guys named James and Matthias were the guys that were assigned to the church back home. Was he the last one to be martyred? Probably not. There are no traditions of Matthias that have him being martyred than about 70 A.D. So probably not the last, although later, potentially after Paul, Peter, after Philip, but probably not the last. So even though he was the last appointed, potentially not the last to be martyred. And of course, John lived much longer than the rest of the group. But Bartholomew is almost certainly martyred later, and perhaps Thomas, maybe one or two of the others. If Simon the Zealot is martyred in Britain, the date is typically believed to be 74. So Matthias would have, if Matthias stayed in Jerusalem, which is reasonably likely, then by the time the Romans breached the walls in AD 70, he was dead. And probably killed by zealots. Probably killed by the Sicarii or by some zealot group as a potential traitor. Matthias may have fallen prey to the idea that as a Christian you were disloyal, and as the Romans are gathering outside the walls, you cannot be tolerated. And so the traditions that have him martyred in Jerusalem have him being stoned, Jewish tradition, a thing that Jewish mobs and Jewish crowds did. And that maybe the stoning didn't kill him or kill him quickly enough. So like James the Just, the guy came in with the fuller's club and beat him to death, that somebody came in with an axe and killed him just to move this forward.
Were the Romans pretty consistent in using crucifixion, whereas these other more creative ways of execution tended to be non-Roman, or is that incorrect?
So when you think about crucifixion, part of the point is it takes some time, right? And it's a picture to others, and so. But in the ancient world, if you wanted to kill somebody for a reason, there was a lot of investment in the idea that you wanted to make it hurt, you wanted to make it last, you wanted to get some emotional satisfaction out of it, you wanted to see some suffering, and so. You think, who would put all this time and energy into killing somebody by sawing them in half or something like that? Well, people that have time on their hands. Sometimes they would get into that sort of stuff. So, anyway, there's a church in Padua in Italy that claims to have relics of Matthias. There's a church in Trier, Germany that claims to have relics of Matthias. And there's a church in Ajara, Georgia, very close to that old Roman fort, that claims to have relics of Matthias. Yeah, and the connection there, the Romans, long before they landed an army in southern Britain to conquer the place in AD 44, there was a major trade between Britain, between England, if you will, today, the southern British Isles and the coast of Europe, that the Romans had a major hand in, and tin was one of the fundamental things that was part of that trade. Tin was being mined in southern Britain, and it was being sold on the continent. And there's huge evidence that that was true, and that the tin trade was not just with, kind of northern France today, but that the Romans carried tin all across the Roman Empire. And so that in the early first century, there is a very strong trade in tin that comes from Britain, and this goes all over the place. And so there is tradition that ties Joseph of Arimathea to Britain, both through the tin trade and because there is traditions that Joseph of Arimathea, after the resurrection, went to Britain and carried the gospel there. There's almost nothing in the very early sources about that, but it's partly because Joseph of Arimathea is not maybe a large enough character in the story to get attention early on. So those traditions come from mostly later, but they could be true. It could be true. That we don't know whether Joseph of Arimathea had any relationship with Jesus. There is a huge fascination in the later first century and in the second and third century about what happened when Jesus was a boy. And so the idea that maybe Joseph of Arimathea took him on business trips or that these other things happened, there's just nothing that we can really get our hands on today. But there are traditions that are well over 1,000 years old, and in some cases closer to 1,500 years old, that point to that kind of thing. So there's nothing that we can point to and say there's really a hard reason to, yes, that's true, but all those traditions about Joseph of Arimathea, none of those could be disproved, and none of them are obviously untrue. There's a lot of traditions from the early area that are pretty obviously untrue. Jesus making clay birds and then turning them to life. Okay, I hope we can accept that one's untrue. Okay, But an awful lot of fascination early on, I mean in the second half of the first millennium, about what happened to Jesus when he was a boy, and what are some of the things about the family, things that were not recorded at the time. So there's a lot of stuff. There are many interesting stories that go with the first century. A lot of this is stuff that comes out of the Middle Ages, when people were looking to build stories or make stories that provided connections, or when people in the church were looking to teach things to people, and so they pulled up stories or moved characters from the New Testament together in ways that would illustrate a point that they were making, which was an approach that at the time was regarded as a useful way of teaching, but people began to understand that as actual history as opposed to an illustration. So it's really difficult to get a lot of stuff in the first century, but there is some pretty good evidence that Simon the Zealot may have made it as far as Britain. We do know that there is Christianity in Britain in the first century. That is for certain. The exact way that it got there is hard to know. There were churches across North Africa in the first century. We don't know exactly how that happened, but Simon the Zealot and Philip the Apostle are likely part of that story.